Dr. Stephen Meyer is a geophysicist and Cambridge University PhD in philosophy of science. He is a New York Times best-selling author and director of the Center for Science and Culture.
The problem is actually not new. It's a problem that was known by Darwin himself. Thus the title of my book, Darwin's Doubt. In fact, here's what he said about the Cambrian fossils. He said, the question as to why we do not find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earlier periods prior to the Cambrian system, I can give no satisfactory answer. The case at present, he said, must remain inexplicable and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the view here entertained, against his theory of evolution by natural selection, of descent with modification. Now, the thing that troubled Darwin was the Cambrian explosion. And I start the book by saying, when Charles Darwin finished his great masterpiece, The Origin of Species, he thought he had explained every clue but one. And the clue that he knew he hadn't explained, the piece of evidence that he knew he hadn't explained, was this absence of ancestral fossils prior to the emergence of the first animal forms, the first forms of animal life. Now, he knew of that mainly because of fossils that he had studied and that his mentors had studied in southern Wales. There was a Cambrian era outcrop, several of them, but a good layers of strata there in southern Wales. So Darwin was aware that these very sophisticated animals, trilobites have compound eyes, for example, and lots of other, you can detect the mouth and the anus, and they have these three lobes and intricate articulated body plan, beautiful animals. And they come into the fossil record suddenly, and through thousands of feet of strata below, there's nothing like these complex animals. And Darwin was aware of this. And so he was troubled by this because his theory imagined a gradual, as I said, bottom-up kind of picture of the history of life. Here's a depiction graphically of the Cambrian explosion. You have the sedimentary strata on the right. You have the geologic time scale with the standard dates on the left, and the little yellow is the explosion. And then the silhouette, or the animal forms there in the middle are representing the different things that came suddenly into the record. And in Darwin's time, there were a few major groups that were known, but they came so suddenly, and at that time there was nothing known in the earlier fossils, or in the sedimentary strata, so it was really a striking thing, and it troubled him. The Cambrian explosion challenged the two main propositions of Darwinian evolution, the two main distinctive ideas that Darwin was putting forward. And I label them evolution number 2 and evolution number 3 because they're both called evolution, but these are different meanings than just change over time. The first of those meanings was Darwin's idea of universal common ancestry or universal common descent. And that's the idea that all of the living forms that exist today are related by common ancestry. They have descended gradually from simpler pre-existing forms of life such that the history of life forms a great branching tree. And that was his theory of the history of life was depicted with this tree-like diagram. So the idea is that all organisms come from a single common ancestor way, way back, probably a simple one-celled organism of some kind, and that the best picture of the history of life is this tree, such that all of the forms of life that exist today, the giraffes and the kangaroos and the tropical fish and the turtles and anything you would like to name, the insects in your backyard, are all related to each other by a pattern of descent, that they share common ancestry if you go far enough back, okay? Now, inherent in this picture is the idea of gradual and continuous change. Evolution in its simplest meaning just means change over time. But Darwin was stipulating that the change that had taken place from those earlier strata where we could see that life was different was continuous, that everything was in some way connected, and that change had taken place gradually. So the Cambrian explosion is right out of the blocks a challenge to that part of Darwinian theory, that meaning of evolution, because it seems to be documenting not gradual, continuous change, but rather sudden, discontinuous change. Okay? And Darwin was troubled by this, and understandably so. Now the second meaning, or third meaning of evolution, second distinctive proposition of Darwin's theory is his idea about the mode of change, about what we call in biology the mechanism. And the mechanism that he proposed was the mechanism of natural selection acting on random variations. He didn't know about mutations yet. Modern neo-Darwinists would emphasize the importance of mutations as a particular kind of variation. But we've talked about natural selection quite a bit at the conference, but this was his idea about how things had changed over time. This was how the change occurred. So the Cambrian explosion, in brief, challenged both his ideas about the historical picture of life, this gradual unfolding, and also his ideas about the mechanism by which that unfolding took place. So it was a fundamental challenge, but because he had explained so many other things so well, it was regarded by Darwin himself and by others at the time as something of a minor anomaly, a little piece of evidence that isn't fitting an otherwise very coherent pattern. And so it was, in a sense, set aside. Darwin himself had an explanation for this. Here's a picture of the origin with his famous phrase, one long argument for descent, that's the historical part, with modification, that's the process or the mechanism part. So yeah, and here you can see the kind of tension. Here's Darwin's picture of the history of life, and here's a picture of animal life. This is an idealized or simplified representation of the Cambrian explosion. The line there between Precambrian and Paleozoic is roughly, and where the little yellow thing is, it's roughly the place where many, many animal forms come into the fossil record. Few of them now we know stretch down a little further, sponges, maybe a few mollusks, but most of the animal forms come suddenly into the record and they either persist all the way to the present or they persist for a while and go extinct. And they don't form a tree-like pattern. The different forms are really disparate, distinct from each other. And so the picture of the history of life, this is, as I said, idealized a little bit. It's perhaps something, instead of like a great tree, it's more like an orchard of separate trees where there's some variability within limits, but everything isn't marrying up the way he expected. Or here's another way of depicting the problem. If you think of the different animal groups, the phyla that arise, there we can represent them with the little gold discs. And Darwin's tree-like picture suggests or predicts, anticipates, that in the Precambrian strata below, you would find animals that were similar but slightly more simple or in some way connected or transitional from something even simpler deeper down. And the problem is the blue discs represent what isn't in the fossil record. And so we have a picture more like this than the picture at the bottom. So you have this contrasting pictures of the history of life, and also that does relate again to the mechanism, because the mechanism needs to work slowly and gradually, and yet that it doesn't seem to be how animals arose. So Darwin acknowledged that this was inexplicable in 1859, but he had a kind of what we call in philosophy of science an ad hoc hypothesis, an attempt to explain away the absence of the evidence that he expected to be there. He said, I look at the natural geological record as a history of the world imperfectly kept. And then he went on, he had beautiful prose, beautiful Victorian prose. He went on to wax eloquent and say, he said, it's like a chapter, it's like a book, where all we have is a few pages in one chapter and a few pages in another and a few lines from one page. And so we have to piece together the whole story from this imperfect preservation of the story. And that was his attempt to explain the absence. And he said, on this view, the difficulties discussed above are greatly diminished. Now, it was a perfectly reasonable thing to propose as an explanation for the absence of the confirming evidence that he hoped to find. And it was also perfectly reasonable to think that in the ensuing generations of scientific investigation of the great sequences of Precambrian strata around the world, that the missing fossils would turn up. But even at the time, there were voices of dissent raised against this idea. One of those was Louis Agassiz. And in the book, I call him Darwin's Nemesis. The two men had great respect for each other. There was no personal animus between the two. I see that I spelled Nemesis wrong at 2 o'clock in the morning last night, so forgive me. But anyway, Agassiz was really the leading paleontologist in the world at the time. He was Swiss-born, comprehensive knowledge of natural history. He built up the Harvard collections. He came to America. He held an endowed chair there. Stephen Jay Gould, the famous paleontologist who died in 2002, held the chair, the Agassiz chair, named for this Agassiz. But he was profoundly skeptical about Darwin's theory precisely because he was such an expert on the fossil record. And it wasn't just that the fossils were missing. That wasn't what bothered Agassiz. It was that the fossil record was selectively incomplete. He said this. He said, Darwin's theory rests partly upon the assumption that in the succession of ages, just those transition types have dropped out from the geological record, which would have proved the Darwinian conclusion had those types been preserved. Here's what he was getting on about. Here's the Tree of Life picture. This is actually a representation of a display that was at a major science museum in the 1990s. And it was about the Cambrian fossils. The parallel lines represent the different phyla. The dots represent the fossils representing those phyla that have actually been found. And if you went to this display in the 90s, as lots of school kids did, the first thing you would go and do is look through the magnifying glasses, right? What are in the magnifying glasses? Well, the magnifying glasses are the nodes, the connecting points of the internal branches that then connect to the terminal branches, to use some of the paleontology lingo, okay? But what was interesting was when you got, if you're a 6th grade kid and you're looking through the magnifying glass, that's the thing that really interests you. What's at the magnifying glass? Well, you look under there, and there was question marks, okay? None of the connecting, the internal branches and the nodes are unrepresented in the fossil record. And Agassiz thought this was curious from a kind of statistical sampling point of view. He said, I understand that the fossil record is incomplete, but why is it mainly incomplete at just those places that you would need fossil representatives in order to document the Darwinian story? There ought to be at least some nodes represented, right? And at the level of the animal phyla, they're just not there. Then in 1909, there was a famous fossil discovery made by Charles Walcott, one of the leading paleontologists at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. He was investigating with his wife some Cambrian fossil beds in the mountains of the Canadian Rockies near Field, BC, at a place that's now known as the Burgess Shale. The Burgess Shale was just a spectacular find. And whereas in the 19th century, the Cambrian event was documented mainly by trilobites and brachiopods, a few other forms, the Burgess Shale documented an array of animal forms, some of which had never been seen before, so much so that Gould wrote this famous book, Wonderful Life, about all these exotic animal forms. And as I update this PowerPoint, as I do more talking about the book, I'll have a lot more pictures, but I pulled 2 in last night. This is a little arthropod-like creature called Morella, or Morella splendens. And it's a lace crab with really delicate appendages. And in some of the fossils, they're preserved so beautifully. These were unknown before. Another crustacean, a guy called Waptia. Can you see? He almost looks like the little shrimp you buy at the grocery store. Can you see the segmentations in the tail? And I mean, beautifully preserved fossils in this dark-colored shale. And all kinds of exotic forms. And as a result of the Burgess Shale, the Cambrian explosion, the mystery of the Cambrian explosion, became even more mysterious. Why? Well, not only had Walcott not found the missing ancestral forms that Darwin had been hoping to find, but he found a whole bunch of new exotic biological forms for which there were also no ancestral forms. Okay, so now the fossil record was even more discontinuous and even more full of exotic form and structure that had to be explained, which arose very suddenly. And by this time now, scientists were also beginning to get a sense of how quickly this had taken place in geologic time. Well, Walcott, however, had a solution, an ingenious solution. As it happened, as a young man, he knew Agassiz actually had sold him some of his fossils, but he ended up siding with Darwin in the great debate. And so he was puzzled by what he had found, but he proposed a solution. And his solution came to be called the artifact hypothesis. It was a variation on Darwin's idea that the fossil record was incomplete. But he put some more flesh and bones on this, and he had an idea. He said there's something in geology called the transgression and regression of seas. And his idea was that while the seas were regressed, where they were back off the continental margins, that all the evolution was taking place. The trilobites were evolving, and they had lots of time to do it. And then, in a later period, the seas rose, and actually, they regressed, and then they transgressed over the continents. And at that point then, when trilobites and marine invertebrates, such as he had discovered, many of the animals he discovered were marine invertebrates, when they died, then they would fall in the sediments. Those would be compacted. Later, the seas would recede again, there would be uplift, and then, millions of years later, on the top of a mountain, you would have marine animals that were preserved during that time. But the reason it appeared, he said, that they arose suddenly was that the seas transgressed over the continents suddenly and started dropping fossils. And he said, the good thing about my theory is that it explains the sudden appearance, saves the Darwinian picture of the history of life, and it's testable. As soon as we're able to start exploring those deep sea sediments, we ought to be able to find the missing Cambrian fossils. Well, by and by, two things happen. Oil companies start drilling offshore, and the sedimentary rocks they're drilling don't show any of these marine invertebrate fossils from the Cambrian era. Secondly, a theory is developed called plate tectonics, which is all about how the crustal material of the Earth is recycled. And it turns out that there are no marine sediments older than about 180 million years, or Jurassic era, much later than the Cambrian. So now there's no geologist today who's expecting to find Cambrian era fossils in marine sediments. So the artifact hypothesis, despite its initial promise, dies a kind of painless death in the 1940s, and the 1960s with plate tectonics. Okay, so we still have a mystery. The mystery hasn't been resolved by this ingenious attempt to explain away the missing evidence. 1984, there's a Cambrian era find in southern China. It's described very, very dramatically in one of the books about the Chinese fossils. One of the scientists said that when he first looked at the Cambrian era creatures on this honey-colored shale, he said they looked alive on the wet surface of the mudstone. The preservation in these Chinese fossils is breathtaking. And it soon garnered international media attention. Time magazine did a huge cover story about the discovery and about the whole problem for Darwinian evolution of the Cambrian explosion. Now, we're in 1995 now, over 100 years after Darwin, and the problem is just getting more and more acute. The mystery is deepening. And I'm going to give you a very impressionistic kind of flyover of some of the things that were discovered in China. This is the fossil site, the Chinese marker of the Cambrian, pre-Cambrian boundary. This is an amazing creature called an anomalocarid. It was about 1 meter long. It was the kind of predator in the Cambrian seas, had huge eyes and pincers. They think it's probably an arthropod. It's a subphylum of the arthropods. Here's another crustacean, another arthropod. But look at the beautiful preservation. You can see the body segments. This guy's called Waptia. There was also one of these discovered at the Burgess Shale, many of them actually. Here's a brachiopods preserved beautifully in China. These were the kind of things that Darwin was finding. Interesting creature called a hyolith. A filter-feeding worm called a phoroniid, a preapulid worm with a strange probing proboscis, another type of worm, an annelid worm with bristles, and on it goes. In fact, recently, A stunning find has been made. This is a strange organism called, it looks like a kind of a jellyfish thing, but it has different internal structure. They think it's its own, like sui generis, its own unique organism. One of my favorites is the comb jellies. They're almost identical to the comb jellies we have running around or swimming around the planet today. And so in 530 million years of evolution, no change. What they call stasis. So an incredible finding, beautifully preserved. And then this was huge international news. Prior to the Chinese fossils, we didn't know of any chordates or vertebrates as far back as the Cambrian. And there have now been, in these Chinese fossils, they found fish. A very interesting kind of fish. This is called a Milo Kunmingia, and he's named for the fossil site. So it's really unbelievable findings. And what it has revealed is a breadth of forms, different forms, what paleontologists call disparity. So lots of disparity, disparate forms of life, and enhancing the discontinuous picture of the history of life that was established by the fossils of which Darwin knew, confirmed and reinforced by the fossils that Walcott found, and now reinforced again. In a sense, nature doubling down to say this is the pattern, it's discontinuous. And lots of different interesting creatures. The other thing about the Chengjiang fossils is that the main burst of innovation takes place in a very narrow seam of rock. I was on the phone with a paleontologist last week. He said even before they had recalibrated this with the fancy radiometric dating, he said, based on standard timescales, this is only going to be maybe 5 to 6 million years. A tiny fraction of Earth history, and you have most of the major body plans that have ever existed on Earth come into the fossil record. It's from a geological point of view, this is a kaboom. It's a real sudden discontinuous event. It's also, and this is the thing that's hard to appreciate, from a neo-Darwinian point of view, this is also extraordinarily rapid. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about this in the Q&A. I might mention it briefly coming up, but the Darwinian mechanism really does have to work slowly. And there is a branch of neo-Darwinian, modern Darwinian theory called population genetics that provides some mathematical equations that allow us to calculate how much change is likely to occur if we know certain factors like the mutation rate or the generation time or the population sizes. And when you start to run the numbers, even, from ordinary, for most of us, 3 to 5 or 5 million years, 6 million years, that sounds like a lot of time. But when you measure that relative to how quickly, or rather how slowly, the neo-Darwinian mechanism works, and the calculated waiting times that you get when you start to look at how long it would take to build actual biological structures using that mechanism, this is a blink of an eye. As there have been several books about the Cambrian with that title. Okay? So it may seem like a long time from our ordinary life experience, obviously it is, but with respect to both geologic time and the time available for the Darwinian mechanism, the neo-Darwinian mechanism to work, this isn't nearly enough. So the Cambrian, the Chinese find in particular, because they were able to date the window of the explosion so tightly, has just created an acute problem for the theory. Okay, now, let's turn the corner and one more thing about the Chinese fossils, and then I'm going to tell you about the two main themes of the book. As these fossils were being discovered, the Cambrian era fossils were being discovered in China, there were other fossils being found in pre-Cambrian beds beneath these Cambrian beds. And this is where you'd want to look if you wanted to find those missing fossils that Darwin had been wondering about. And some fossils were found, but oddly they have accentuated the problem. They've deepened the mystery. In fact, what has been discovered in a formation called the Dushantu Shale are tiny microscopic sponge embryos, soft-bodied microscopic creatures. Now, why is that important? Well, because after Walcott, the next version of the artifact hypothesis was that, well, the Darwinian picture of the history of life is correct, But we're just not seeing those ancestral forms because they were either too soft or too small to have been preserved. Along comes the discoveries in southern China. There's a scientist, Chinese-American scientist, Paul Chen, who's done some of this work. He's a marine biologist who perfected methods for viewing sponge embryos in living sponges in his doctoral work in a cross-section under a microscope. And he was able to view these sponge embryo fossils and determine that they had distinctive spicules, a feature of sponges. So it's a very definitive sort of conclusion that he drew. And there are some people that dispute it, but they're proposing, well, they're not sponge embryos, they're protists or other small microscopic organisms. So here's the problem. If the Precambrian strata beneath the explosion, beneath the beds that document the explosion, can preserve small, microscopic, soft creatures, why didn't they preserve the immediate ancestors of all these intricate animal forms with all their hard parts and everything else? The big animals that came into existence, the trilobites, the animalocarids, the waptias, the opabinias. Shouldn't we at least find some rudimentary remains of those structures, of those animals, or the structures out of which they were made? But there's nothing. And yet, the depositional environment was sufficiently favorable to preserve these small microscopic sponge embryos, putting to lie the claim that the ancestral forms of the Cambrian animals were not preserved because the depositional environment was not capable of preserving things that were small and soft. Okay? So that has now deepened the mystery still.
To view this program again and share it with your friends, and to learn more about this series, these conferences, and the intersection of science and faith, please go to www.pensmore.org.
The preceding was brought to you by the Pensmore Foundation and NRB TV.